Welcome everyone to the Ex Umbris podcast. Gerard McLarney, and with me is Schoolman Fawcett.
Schoolman Fawcett, often referred to as Brett, but on this particular show, we're going to have to qualify that. But before we get into it, this is a classical Catholic education in podcast form. We are teachers at the Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore Learning Center, world's only online Chesterton Academy. This podcast is a bit of a taste of what a class with us might be like. And today we have a guest lecturer,
Very special guest.
I'll just let him introduce himself, really. His name is also Brett. We don't usually continue calling ourselves by our opening titles. We get lapsed into Gerard and Brett, I think, in the course of today we have another Brett. So we're going to be referring to him as Dr. Brett. And that is 100% because of his gigantic ego that we have to pad to encourage him to stay on the show. It's definitely not just because we need to conveniently distinguish him from myself. But we have Dr. Brett Salkeld on here, and frankly, too many accomplishments to really summarize. The most important, of course, being that he's a member of the popular cover band Said Contra. But what else do you do in your spare time when you're not performing it?
Okay.
Oh my gosh. Yes, pad my own ego. Here we go. Well, I'm a father of 7 children. That's probably my most lasting accomplishment. Yeah, I play in a cover band. I'm a theologian for the Archdiocese of Regina. I'm a writer and a speaker and a podcaster. Brett, you've been on my show, I don't even know how many times, 5 or 6 maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, really, it was just a long-term investment to get you on ours, really. That's
right.
How it works, yeah.
Paying dividends.
Exactly, yes, but that's called, what's the title of that podcast for everyone to go check out?
Thinking Faith.
Thinking Faith, with Deacon Eric there as well as
That's right. So, yeah, and I'm the theologian for the Archdiocese of Regina. That's my day job. And I do diaconate formation here, among many other things, but that's like the top of my list. My to-do list for the diocese is the deacon program. Yeah, and I keep busy with all kinds of this kind of stuff. Sure. My own podcast, other people's podcasts. I have a column.
You're a writer. Yes, you're a writer. That's what we want to build to. Recently wrote a book that I was happy to kind of help within a really tiny way. A great book on Catholic faith permeation, integration in Catholic schools. Those of you who are watching is Educating for Eternity, Teacher's Companion for Making Every Class Catholic, which we could maybe talk about one day. But prior to that, he wrote, I think you were best known maybe, arguably, for your book on transubstantiation, which is kind of the topic we're going to be circling around today, I think.
I mean, our listeners, some of them certainly, our students will have heard of transubstantiation, but what exactly is going on when we use that term? What do we mean by substance, the background, and so forth?
Right, that's the word that jumps out of that. Transubstantiation is substance, right?
Right.
Yeah. And the topic that I wanted to talk about, actually, I want to hone in on substance specifically, because hearing Dr. Brett expound this in various podcasts, talking about the book, and teaching Descartes. Teaching Descartes here at Chesterton Academy made me realize this might sound really arcane, like, oh, what's the definition of substance? But Dr. Brett, I think we'd agree, actually, it's really helpful and necessary even to kind of have a handle on what we mean when we talk about substance. Could you flesh that out? No pun intended.
Sure, yeah. So let me flesh it out in terms of why the church found it helpful in discussing its Eucharistic doctrine at the time it did. Because transubstantiation is not a biblical term, like the term the Trinity. It comes from later reflection, questions that are put to the church in history and then need to be resolved with language that makes sense to the people at the time. And so the church, for a long time, this is a fascinating thing, the church does not really have Eucharistic controversies for like 800 to 900 years. Jesus's claims that he is present with us were taken more or less at face value. The early church, they weren't shy about fighting about doctrine, but they mostly fought about Christology, that there were no real debates about the Eucharist. And then the philosophical landscape shifted, and a question started to be put. The first iteration of it is from the Emperor Charles the Bald, asks a couple of monks at a abbey in France whether Christ is present truly or figuratively in the Eucharist. And one of them says truly and the other says figuratively. But if you look at what they said, both of them are actually trying to be faithful to the teaching of the church. You know, we might think now, looking back, well, one of them's a heretic. You know, like truly is the right answer and figuratively is the wrong answer. But in the time before that, you know, Augustine is kind of the lead voice here, at least in the West. Christ's presence is strongly affirmed, but it's understood in sacramental terms, which means that figures or signs are actually essential for understanding what's going on. And so you could see how someone who's trying to be faithful to the church would say figuratively.
I just kind of a footnote that if you're thinking in a Platonic landscape, right? Saying something is a sign doesn't mean, oh, it's just some arbitrary thing that represents some completely unrelated thing, right? In a Platonic participatory worldview, being a sign, like you're directly participating in the thing that you're representing, right?
Right. And that's a big reason why there's no debate for a long time, is because in the Mediterranean world, for the first sort of 800 years of Christianity, people are sort of functionally Platonists. And so if you ask a Platonist, is this a sign or is it real? They just say yes. You know, it's not a problem for them, but it becomes a problem later. And this starts sort of boiling. Is it true? Is it figurative? And people sort of end up doubling down on both sides. You get the articulators of the true presence with some sort of cannibalistic almost language. But then you get articulators of the other side, who end up with articulations that sound like what's happening in the Eucharist is just sort of what happens in your head and mine. So the best analogy I can think of for this is something like a national flag, right? So we all agree that the maple leaf on a white background with red bars on the sides represents Canada. And then we act accordingly. So it actually, like, it's not nothing, right? It disturbs us if someone burns it or tramples it or flies it upside down or whatever, right? But we also know that, like, we gave it that meaning, and apart from our agreement on what's happening here, it's not inherent in the thing itself. It has meaning because the community has agreed on its meaning. And so that's what the sort of figurative camp starts sounding like. Well, that's not enough in the church's tradition. But the other side, the cannibalism side, everyone looks at that and says, well, that can't be right either. And so the church needs a new way of talking about how Christ's presence in the Eucharist is real, that takes account of the sacramental character of the Eucharist. And what ends up emerging from this is the doctrine of transubstantiation. And it comes about because substance, around this time, Western Europeans are rediscovering Aristotle, in large part due to the Crusades. Aristotle was preserved in parts of the Middle East, and Crusaders were able to bring back texts, and they were translated into Latin. And so people like Thomas Aquinas are starting to work with Aristotelian categories. And in Aristotle's metaphysics, he has these categories of substance and accidents. And accidents are what are present to our senses. So things we perceive by our senses. That's pretty important if you're talking about signs, right? Because signs are always perceived by sight or touch or, you know, some sense or other. But those signs aren't the full reality. In fact, they sort of present to us a deeper reality. And that deeper reality is called substance. And the reason the signs aren't enough, it sounds arcane, but it's actually really common sense. Like, we all know that if you get a haircut, you don't lose your identity. Like, we know that physical changes, now there are different kinds of physical changes, but in and of themselves, physical changes aren't enough to change an identity. So you need some underlying principle of identity that can let you say, like, Brett is still Brett if I shave his head. I mean, that's a really rough and ready sort of thing. But so then for Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, substance is that which is present to the intellect. So our senses perceive physical things, and then our intellect perceives through our sense organs something that the intellect can affirm as an independently existing thing that we can, like, confidently say, this is Brett, or this is sugar, or that's a horse, or or that's a river valley, or whatever it is, our intellect can affirm something through the senses, but not in a way that's limited to the senses, because our intellect understands that changes in the sense data are not tantamount to changes in the substance of a thing. They can be in some cases, right? If I burn a tree, that's different than cutting off a branch of a tree. I can cut a branch off a tree and it's still a tree, but if I burn a tree, it becomes ashes and smoke and whatever else. It can become a different thing, and that's accounted for in the theory too. But that's a kind of rough and ready introduction. Mm-hmm. The really key distinction, though, is that which is present to the senses versus that which is present to the intellect. That was the really key, and I think for most people, a straightforward way of understanding why those two categories were seen as valuable. And then, and then let me finish with this. So then in the Eucharist, of course, you have something where you have a sign that is apprehensible by the senses. And you also have a claim in the history of the church that something is changing. And if you just look at it, it's not the sign that's changing. So substance comes in real handy, because you have something that's not the sign, that's intrinsically related to it, that could be changed. And so substance language starts being used, and within about a generation of substance language being used, there's a new term coined, and the term is transubstantiation, which becomes, in relatively short order, the dominant way of speaking about it in the church. And then at the Council of Trent is sort of defined. It's a really interesting definition. It's defined according to Catholic teaching, official Catholic teaching. Transubstantiation is the most aptissime, the most apt way of speaking about the mystery. So it doesn't say it's the only way. It doesn't say it just is the thing. It recognizes that there's a kind of gap between our ability to articulate and the thing itself, but also that we're going to attempt those kinds of articulations. And it says, like, this is the best we've got. It doesn't even say that theoretically it's the best we could ever have. Though you might want to read it that way, but that's not actually what it says. It just says it's the best we got.
Yeah. Can I now just ask some basic questions here to clarify? Maybe some of our listeners might be wondering the same thing. So
sure.
Until the 9th century or so, or the 8th century, we have not much of a debate, but then there's the figurative versus the truly camp. Figurative, in some cases, it's almost the observer it needs to be active in order to give currency, if you like, to what's happening in the Eucharist, or like the analogy of the flag and so on. But then once we introduce these Aristotelian categories, we can now distinguish between accident, which is something perceptible by the senses or to the senses, with substance, and substance is something that is engaged with by the intellect.
Right.
Is that right? Yeah.
Perfect.
So, now, the intellect, though, is this, going back to, I guess, maybe Platonic ideas, but is the intellect participating somehow in the substance, in that you can perceive it now? So what's the connection then between the substance and the intellect, in that, like, am I still giving currency to the substance by engaging with it? Or is it the other way around? I'm getting the currency from the substance into my intellect. So it's not that we together are thinking with our intellect, so it becomes a substance, but rather it's the stream is the other reversed. It's from the substance that's being perceived by our intellect, and now we can perceive what the substance is. And so
yeah, I would
not like the figurative camp still is going on, even though we've changed the terminology.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. So I would say it's the second option. So key for the church's consideration of Eucharistic presence is that it's a gift. Like, we can't make it, we can only receive it. And that sort of maps onto the, what's the word I want? Like the theory of knowing. It maps onto the epistemological question, right? About, like, we don't create reality by knowing it. We apprehend reality and we can accept it. Now, we might make mistakes, right? We know about, optical illusions or any number of other reasons why we might make mistakes in our apprehension of reality. But reality precedes us, and then we perceive it rightly or wrongly and then apprehend it with our intellects rightly or wrongly, but we don't determine it. And that's really important for the doctrine of real presence, is that it's God is the determinant, not us. God makes these to be what they are, and we receive them as a gift. And so there's an interesting sort of theological angle, which is Protestants would want God to be the main actor.
Right.
But reducing the Eucharist to a symbol actually makes the human community the main actor.
Right.
So there's a weird irony. Now, not all Protestants reject real presence. We should be careful to notice that Luther. In fact, that's the Protestant Reformation. The first split in their own ranks was on this question between realists in the Lutheran camp and symbolists in the Swiss camp. But it's ironic, at least for those Protestants who reject a sense of real presence and take an only symbolic approach, they end up having humans as the main actors in the liturgical action, which feels off for Protestantism, right? Because Protestantism wants the primacy of God's action, and we can agree with them about that. So you end up with this kind of irony there.
Right, because on that level, we're giving currency to
we've chosen a symbol to endow with this meaning that it stands
for.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I kind of want to step back to kind of where the whole idea of substance comes from in the first place, because I want to get to the point where we really explain, here's why this is such a useful concept for talking and thinking about the Eucharist, where we can affirm what Christ said is 100% true, but also your senses aren't lying to you when you look at the bread. People fall into all kinds of weird mistakes from having too materialist an idea of substance. But before we get there, I kind of want to get all the way back to the ancient Greece and kind of see where Aristotle comes up with this, what problem he's trying to solve, because it goes beyond the Eucharist. It goes actually to what Dr. Brett's saying about epistemology in general, right?
Right.
So an early philosophical problem that a lot of people probably know about, well, a couple of them that I can think of would be, there's the ship of Theseus. The good old ship of Theseus, where the ship is progressively, he keeps taking parts off the ship, puts them in the river, and they float downhill, and then he replaces them with new parts until eventually his ship is built entirely of new material. And then what's his face? Bob downstream keeps picking them up, and he builds his own ship until eventually he's got a ship that's built entirely out of the same stuff Theseus used, which is the original ship of Theseus.
Oh, okay.
Right. If you're a strict materialist, it seems like Bob has the ship of Theseus, because it's materially exactly the same.
Yeah.
Whereas Theseus's ship is materially completely different than it was recently, but that seems like it can't be true. So and of course the relevance, not that they necessarily knew this in ancient Greece, although I'm sure they intuited it, that we recycle all our cells every 7 years apparently, right? So am I a different person than I was 8 years ago? There must be something else going on there. And the other famous example, of course, is I'll let Dr. Brett talk about this, and he can explain why substance solves this problem. Is Heraclitus and his problem about jumping in a river. Dr. Brett, do you want to speak to that and how Aristotle's idea of substance solves these problems?
Sure. I'll jump into that, but let me push the ship of Theseus analogy with our bodies one step further. So imagine that I've got some tomato plants in my house, right? Now apparently most household dust is actually skin cells. Right? So my tomato plant, in the soil of my tomato plants, is the skin cells from the various members of my family and the visitors that we've had to our house, right? So those are taken in and metabolized by the plant, and some portion of that ends up in the tomatoes, which we then put in a salad and then eat. So now we all have some material components of one another. And now, do we get confused at that point and say, I'm no longer Brett, I'm actually now like some tiny percentage of me is like Daisy, and like it gets really weird, right? It's just it's not intuitive, but it follows if that's how you think of identity, right? So anyway, I just wanted to follow up with that, but the river, right? So this is made famous. When I do talks on this, I reference the Disney movie Pocahontas, because in the sort of lead musical number, The Colors of the Wind, Pocahontas says the wonderful thing about rivers is you can't step in the same river twice. And so I ask, the audience at one of my talks if that's right or not. And it's interesting to see the reactions, because they know what is meant here, right? If you can't step in the same river twice, they know that the water that you stepped in yesterday is far downstream, and the riverbed has shifted subtly, and the vegetation and the animal life have grown a little or died, or it's in a constant state of flux. That's the point, and we want to recognize that that's true about reality. But then you also say, like, okay, so I went down to the Capel River yesterday and I stepped in it, and then I went down to the Capel River today and I stepped in it again. Like, what did I step in? If it wasn't the Capel River, like, what was it? And then I say, like, a geologist might tell you, the Capel River is the largest glacial spillway in the world. And so that means that we can actually trace its origins back to the last ice age, which we're talking, tens of thousands of years. And that it would have looked radically different, when that retreating glacier stopped in the prairies and shed a bunch of its water and washed out this part of the world and formed a river valley. But is it coherent or not to call the Capel River the largest glacial spillway in the world? Because if it's not even the same river today as it was yesterday, it's certainly not a tens of thousands year old glacial spillway. And since we all know that it actually is coherent to speak in this way, then there must be some way of accounting for its identity over time despite changes. And that's what substance allows us to do, right? It says, despite these changes, all the river that's run over tens of thousands of years, all those water molecules that have gone downstream and gone to the ocean or evaporated or whatever else happened to them, right? That's not the determining factor. There's something else that your intellect can apprehend underneath those accidental changes. And if you don't have that, you end up with just a ton of problems. Like, you can't identify yourself from one day to the next. You can't identify a river from, and then you're forced into thinking, like, all of this stuff, all of the common sense way of speaking and identifying things is just a sort of helpful illusion, which is a sort of deeply unsatisfying approach to reality, right?
Yeah. So when we can make this distinction then between accident and substance, accident would be just literally on the surface of things, what our senses report. But if we can understand the concept of substance, we're going beyond that, as opposed to being deflected back, where that's just be an illusion, right? If we're going to call the Capel River or Dr. Brett or Brett, whatnot, that's just an illusion that we're imposing on the thing. If we're just all we can work with are accidents,
right? Yeah.
Whereas if we have a substance, then we can go beyond the surface of what's there and to somewhere else, as opposed to being refracted back.
This might be where it's a good opportunity to define substance, right? To kind of be clear what we mean by this, because what we're saying is, if you look at a river or a human being or any material thing on just a material level, you'll find all the material elements are always changing. I mean, like, Heraclitus is in some sense right. I mean, quantum physics, right? Everything's just energy, right? That's always constantly in flux and changing, right? But that would mean that nothing really exists because everything is always changing. So there must be something that stands, in the case of a river, there's all the water that's constantly flowing, everything you mentioned. There must be something other than what we can observe that stands underneath all of those and somehow holds it together. Hence, substantial, it stands underneath and kind of holds these accidents together. And that's called a substance. Like, that's the term we've kind of come up for it, or like by way of the Latin. So how specifically do we define a substance in contradiction to an accident?
Right. So a substance is an independently existing thing. So, like, a ball can be red, but red doesn't exist independently of a ball. Red is an accident, and it always inheres in a substance, right? You just can't point to a red. Like, hey, look at that red. No, it's a red. Like, look at that red stop sign. Look at that red ball. Look at that red, something. I mean, really, it's the difference between nouns and adjectives.
Yeah.
Like, right? We just know intuitively. You don't say, hey, look at that big, or look at that red, or look at that, any adjective you can pick. They need something to in the technical language inhere in. So a red, red inheres in a red ball or in a red stop sign, but there's something But see, you could describe the ball from the point of view of accidents quite deeply, right? You talk about its shape and its density and its color and its size and all kinds of stuff. And because you can describe so many different kinds of accidents, you can almost trick yourself into thinking, well, they all sort of inhere in each other, right? So so the most basic accident is the fact that something takes up space at all, right? Sometimes this is called the dimensive property, right? That it has dimensions. And so you might just think, well, that's given. That's the real underlying thing. And then color or anything else sort of adheres in that. And in fact, it's that move that ends up changing substance from being the thing which underlies any of the accidents to sort of crossing the aisle to becoming one of the accidents. And so one of our problems with substance, and for Catholics, for understanding their own church's teaching on the Eucharist, is that substance no longer means for us in common parlance what it meant for Thomas Aquinas and for the church when they defined transubstantiation. For Aquinas and the tradition, it was that which is present to the intellect and undergirds all the accidental properties. But sometime between Thomas and the Reformation, it starts to become one more accident. And I don't know all this detail up through Descartes. I only follow it up to about John Calvin. But by the time of Luther and Calvin, it makes transubstantiation incoherent, and all the reformers reject it. And what they reject is something Thomas Aquinas himself rejects, which is a sort of clandestine change of the accidents. And Thomas is like, well, no, that's not it. But
what do you mean by a clandestine change of the accidents?
Well, clandestine in the sense that we can't discern it, right? But it must be something like, because
let's hone in on this, because I think this is the way a lot of Catholics think nowadays, right? So when a lot of people hear the idea that the body, the bread is changed into the body of Christ, but retains the accidents of bread, I think what a lot of people are sort of visualizing is you can't see it happening, but actually this little round wafer has now turned into a guy with hair and legs, you know what I mean, and teeth and blood and sinews. And God is kind of veiling that under the
our senses are deceived.
And so you'll see, I mean, I remember, I'm sure Dr. Brett remembers this too, with someone on the website formerly known as Twitter made a comment about how when we eat the Eucharist, we're not swallowing a kneecap. And he got a whole bunch of zealous responses from well-meaning Catholics who said, yeah, that's a heresy, because it's when the real presence means that this is turned into the body of Christ. Therefore, of course, we are swallowing a kneecap when we eat. And that shows that they are thinking of substance as being identical to its accidents, which in a minute, I'll get to this, that's Descartes' fault. But that's actually not the traditional, it's not the philosophical or the theological definition of substance.
Right.
Because you're conflating it with a physical, and physical is another term that we can get to, but you're conflating the substance with these various accidents.
Right. So there's,
is that what we mean by the clandestine?
Yeah.
Yes.
So the language used in the Middle Ages by some people, right, is that there are veils drawn over it because God doesn't want us too grossed out by eating a guy's body, so God kind of disguises it so we can't see what we're doing.
So the accidents have changed. They're imperceptible.
Exactly. That's how some people. And that's both Aquinas. I think this is what you're saying, Dr. Brett. Both the Reformers and Aquinas want to reject that.
Right.
The accidents have actually changed. We just don't see it happening.
Okay.
Right.
That's a contradiction in terms, is it not? Well, I guess they say there's a veil. So that's how they get it.
Right. That's how
yeah. Okay.
So there's a couple case studies here that are interesting. One is Aquinas himself says there can be no deception in the sacrament. So he rejects this veil argument explicitly because he says, no, the accidents of bread and wine, which remain, actually need to remain, not as a covering to veil the reality, but as a sign that points to the reality. That's how sacraments work. Jesus chose bread and wine not as a disguise for his presence, but as a sign of his presence. And so Catholics who want to downplay the physical reality of the bread and wine are actually missing how sacraments work. Physical reality of the bread and wine are the signs that our senses perceive that lead us to Christ. So that's one thing. But here's another sort of thought experiment. Some atheist, kidnaps a host consecrated host from a Catholic mass and takes it into the lab and runs the tests and comes out on social media and says, I've run the tests, I've disproved Catholic, faith in real presence because I just ran the tests in the lab and found out that this consecrated host is no different from an unconsecrated host. And now, if you put that in front of Catholics, a lot of them feel like they're in a really awkward position, and they'll say like, well, Jesus could have unconsecrated himself to prevent a kind of desecration. Maybe there's a kind of veil. But Thomas Aquinas' answer would be, I told you so, you moron. Like that's exact. If you read my book, you'll see that's exactly what I tell you to expect. Right? So Catholics are thrown into this crisis when someone proves, in scare quotes, proves that there's no physical change. But he's like, no, that's the doctrine. That's how it works,
And this goes back to the whole point of, you'll sometimes hear this from other Christians. I hear this from Eastern Orthodox sometimes. Well, with transubstantiation, that's over-explaining the mystery, right? Like you're giving this like rigid scholastic account of this thing that's the action of God and it's mysterious. And that's not the point of it, right? Like the point is, how can we talk in a way that doesn't fall into heresy, right? In a way that's true, about the fact that this looks like bread, but is Jesus. And Aquinas' brilliance is that he says, well, actually, there's in a sense a common sense answer to this, which is everything you've ever interacted with has an immaterial reality that you actually only know by your intellect, not by your senses. And then there's the sensory stuff, and you already know those are different things. This is just another example of that.
If you can tell the difference between a noun and an adjective,
exactly,
you already know this. Actually, my friend Deacon Fritz Bauerschmidt says when he teaches this to his undergrads, he says you don't actually need Aristotle to understand transubstantiation. You need the object permanence you'd expect of the average 2-year-old.
Yes. Oh, my son as well. He's on top of object permanence, and he is not 2 years old yet. Which shows that he's smarter than some philosophers. The